I'm Dr. Cath Watson, and today PD Insurance has asked me to talk to you about wet food versus dry food. Which should you feed? What do you need to know about them? So I'm going to start with wet food. This covers canned foods, sachets, pet rolls, anything that has moisture in it. So the first thing to understand about wet food is that it does contain water. So a fair chunk of what you're buying is based on weight, and a lot of that weight is going to be from water. So they do tend to, on a calorie basis, be a more expensive way of feeding than dry food. However, because of that, they also tend to be lower calorie and a little bit harder for us to overfeed on. And I say us to overfeed on because we're in control of how much food they get. So if you've got a pet that is at risk of obesity, then potentially having some wet food in the mix rather than feeding all dry food, or even feeding completely wet food, may be a way of helping control how much you give them, so how many calories they get. But like I say, it does tend to be a more expensive way of feeding over the long term. Wet foods can often have a shorter shelf life as well, not always, but check the expiry dates. They do tend to contain more preservatives as a result of that. The other downsides of wet food is that they tend to be smellier and more likely to attract flies. And again, depending on where you live in the country, summertime, that may be a major concern. So you may want to have a think about whether wet food's going to work for your household as well. There's always packaging waste, and particularly if you're talking about sachets or tins, not so bad because they're recyclable, but anything that's a single serve, there's obviously going to be a lot of waste generated with that. You can use wet food, particularly cans or pet roll, and slice it up really thin, bake it in the oven and use that as treats. That may be a cheaper, more convenient way for you to create some healthy treats for your pets rather than buying separate packets of treats. As far as dry food goes, it does tend to be very convenient, which is great. It does tend to also be cheaper over the long term, and that's across the range of dry foods available, purely because it is more calorie dense, so it's much more efficient to feed for the same calories compared to wet food. But it does have some storage issues as well. So dry food really needs to be stored in an airtight container because over time the fats in the food are going to go rancid. That ends up maybe not creating a smell that's offensive to you, but you may find your cat or your dog starts turning up their noses towards the end of a packet if it hasn't been stored appropriately. Mentioning that, there can be some palatability issues with dry food. It doesn't tend to be quite as tasty as some of the wet foods out there. Having said that, there's also some really yummy ones around, so it might just be you need to play around a little bit with what your cat or dog particularly likes. Dry food also tends to be a much more consistent formula over time, and you can also use dry food as treats. There's absolutely no reason, particularly for dogs when it comes to training for tricks, and I should say cats, if they're food motivated, using the food that they like for dinner and using that as the treats for teaching them a new trick. Absolutely no reason you can't do that. Obviously, just make sure, because as I said, the dry food does tend to be more calorie dense. If you're going to use their normal food as treats as well, just make sure you're not giving them an extra helping as you're giving them the treats on top of what you'd normally give, or you are going to have some obesity issues to deal with as well.